just rediscovered the Neue Nationalgalerie that has been unveiled to us. It must be a weird moment for you, because you have been intensively working on this project until now, and now you have released it to the world for us to enjoy it once again. So, what's your feeling about the building at this point, and about all this weekend where you have released this project that you have so intensely worked on these past years to us?
You first.
Okay. Well, this building plays an important role in my life, in that I was there from day one. I am here on the last day, shall we say, of the process of giving eternal life to this building. And I learned a lot in the process. I grew close to my grandfather, talking about the building and the various spaces and ideas, concepts, etc. And I identify with it so much, more that my life depended on it so much. And it was a particular pleasure, out of the blue, a few years ago, maybe, when was that, 10 or 8 years ago, that I was asked by the Stiftung Preußischer Kulturbesitz to participate in the selection of the right restoration architect. And I was just an inexperienced member in these matters, and I was listening to several presentations of other architects. And when David appeared, and in his unforgettable, modest but direct way, speaking about how he would approach the process, I knew this was the right man. This was the right team. And even though I didn't have a major voice in the selection, I nevertheless spoke up on behalf of this group.
Thank you.
And the collaboration with David's team, but also with the building department under Arne Maibaum, has been, in fact, from day one, a very good, very warm, very understanding and sensitive process. And it isn't as if we all just shook hands and said, this is great. No. We looked at everything. We debated everything. There were questions raised, and we knew what the critique had already said. And I just want to end my opening remarks to say that I feel now that I've been here for the reopening. This building is magnificent, is important. It is not only important in Mies's work, it's a very important building in his work or my work or whatever. It is an important building in Berlin, because when Werner Duttmann, I can go on. Werner Duttmann, who was the Senate's Baudirektor at the time in the late 50s, came to see Mies in Aachen, where Mies was visiting his old hometown, and asked him if he would design a gallery offered the 20th century art in West Berlin. Mies was very pleased, because he spent 30 years living in Berlin, and other than a few villas and homes from before World War I, more or less, he didn't really build anything in Berlin. And this is the only building he designed after World War II in his lifetime, and it's an important building. And he made reference repeatedly to his admiration for Schinkel and the classicism of Berlin. And if you really analyze and experience the building, there's no doubt, to me, it's a classical building. Even though it, of course, is very modern as well. So let me not speak too long about this.
David, well, we are all engaging with this building, re-engaging, or probably disengaging. Again, what's been your feeling at this point? And then the next question would be, how was the collaboration between both of you?
Well, I think, to turn your question around a bit, and follow the point that Dirk said about collaboration, that one of the experiences that we had from the museum, and especially Neues Museum, was how to tackle a project that required such a complex discussion of issues. And there is a sort of notion that architecture is a sort of singular activity and it requires a brilliant idea. But of course, as Dirk says, the process is a complex one. We have, as architects, artistic tendencies, but we're not artists. We are engaged in something much more complex than that, and therefore that engagement with clients, with consultants, with a huge team of people is fundamental to the way that we practice, and increasingly becomes so. And in a project like this, that process is very critical to the result, because you must resolve conflicting issues between technical, heritage and aesthetic, operational, financial, and it's your ability to tackle those which are important. And I think we're both quite unified in the fact that this time round was slightly different to the last time round in a way. We had to solve a lot of things, and it required deep engagement. And first of all, I have to say at my end, my team, I'm talking on behalf of a big team and led by Martin Reichardt and Sascha Schwarz. I think they're both here. This process is important, and clearly architecture is measured in the end by the product, by the result. But process is a profoundly important aspect of that and affects the result. And I think it's probably fair to say that in a project like this, you cannot get a good result without a good process. And in that, I would also say that what was important, that we were supported in that process from not just our teams and consultants, but also by the client. It's very important that the restoration of Neues Museum was regarded as an important task. It would have been very easy to treat it as a practical problem, a technical problem. We were insistent that things had to be done to the highest level, and we were fortunate to have clients that supported us in that.
You said before starting the project that every restoration project requires a philosophical framework, where you question the substance of the building, its meaning, and it's not just about it. It leads the conversation beyond just technical decisions. So how did you both, in your collaboration, approach this task and outline this philosophical framework?
I think we can say a little bit about Mies in this, because he's the central and guilty figure in every way. In that he was a protagonist that created this extraordinary building. And unlike so much modern architecture, Dirk refers to him as a classical architect, which is true. He's also a modern architect that believed in a rather old-fashioned way in substance. The history of modern architecture is slightly schizophrenic between the way things are made and the way things look. And there are moments, I think, in modern architecture where one would have to say that construction and materiality were less important than image. And I'm not just talking about now, I'm talking even back in the 1920s, the beginning of modernism, I would say. Mies somehow had such confidence and put such intensity into structure, obviously, but also the materiality. It's very strange that a building that is effectively a glass building, that, you know, everything is so material, including the glass. Especially now we've put back good glass. And that's a very unusual thing in modern architecture. And the reason that I pick up on that is that if you then restore modern buildings, as opposed to restore a building from the 19th century made of stone or something, it's very easy to cut corners. It's very easy to take metal window frames, which we can reproduce quite easily, replace them with something very similar. It's very easy. It would have been very easy on that building, you know, to replace everything with something that looked roughly the same. I think the success was that we refused that position, and we kept everything as if it was highly valuable. Every window, mullion, every piece of stone, we kept everything as if it was an archaeological process. That we didn't undervalue the material, even if it was only 50 years old, and even if lots of it looked like you could have bought it again.
Yeah.
And I think philosophically, that was very important. I mean, even the painting, you know, the paintwork of the black, which is, you know, another weird thing that Mies manages to make black paint into substance, material. If we had just overpainted that, which would be easy, I mean, what's the problem? I mean, in project management terms, every decision we made could have been reduced to something similar. To persuade everybody that we should uncover the paint, repatch it, softly restore it. It requires clients and it requires a team spirit that doesn't think that that's a crazy idea, but recognizes that that's fundamental to achieving, you know, the physical quality. And if our feeling is that if you didn't do it, you would kill the building, not by one big mistake, but 100 small mistakes. And similarly, you keep the spirit of the building, not by one big idea, but 100 small ideas. And that's quite a difficult thing to hold on to in our culture.
If I may add something to these thoughts you just mentioned, I really admire and have learned to appreciate and support this process of not throwing away what was no longer good looking or was broken or whatever. I have seen your stone people taking the granite plates and actually gluing them together, and they're in place again. and you can search for the joints if you have an eye for this, but it's not easy to find. As I look at the facade with all the granite, around in the courtyard, outside, and so on, occasionally you see some stone that is whiter, brighter, stands out from the rest. That is probably one of the few really new ones. And the fact that this is acceptable to me is a wonderful thing, because where I come from in our society in the US, if it ain't good anymore, you throw it out. Put a new one in, everything. So that is, that's...
And the new one would be cheaper. The new one would be cheaper, and you would save money.
Yeah, probably, yes. But I personally think that the recreation of the glass wall of the hall is a masterpiece. And that will be evident only over time. Right now it looks good because it's all freshly done and painted, and the glass is wonderful. By the way, the glass is amazing. It's so flat, it doesn't have these typical mirror distortions that you see in a lot of building glass, particularly on high-rise buildings in cities and so on. But the fact that we solved the glazing, the insulation, the heating and ventilation of the wall, and the thermal expansion of the steel. There's a joint on top of the roof, so the roof can move a little bit. And there are joints in the horizontal expansion. They're not visible, but the steel can breathe, so to say. And I see that part as one of the great achievements of this renovation.
And I think this is really visible when you look at the building right now. So how much patina did you allow yourself to keep? Because I think it's a very delicate decision up to what point you make it look new again or leave some traces of timelessness.
Yeah, I mean, an architecture of modernism which is gets its energy from the technology of the machine age, it is not enjoying patina. It is. So modern architecture didn't really anticipate that in the same way that stone buildings or even timber buildings do. And it's not just about wear, it's about the intolerance of staining and things like that on that type of building. So there is something particularly unforgiving about that architecture. There's not much forgiving on that. So we weren't looking for patina in an explicit way, but we were looking not to lose anything that Mies had given the building. And as I'm repeating myself, but we're in a world where it's very easy to down-spec, to make substitute. And when we make buildings, the pressure is continuously to question quality in place of money and time. So in architecture, we deal with a triangle. It's time, money, quality, time, money, quality, time, money, quality. And time and money is always fixed. So there's only one flexible, it's quality. And how can you argue for quality when you don't even have it? At the end of the project, you can say, yeah, you see, I told you. You can't do it before. It's really difficult. And that's why on this project, we really should be grateful that acts which could have been done much more extreme. We call it, unfortunately, we now call it project management. I mean, project management has become how to do things quicker and cheaper. It shouldn't be that. It should be how to do the highest quality. So I would say, we were really blessed in this project that it was accepted. And that's, again, we have to thank Mies. Because why is there so much affection for a building that's only 50 years old? A building that isn't explicitly beautiful to most laymen. The petrol station joke, it wasn't necessarily loved from the beginning in an obvious way. People don't necessarily relate to modern architecture in a very emotional manner in the way that they might do to a building like this church. But so we have to really be fascinated by how did Mies make a building in this city at that time, which, as Dirk says, is not only important to the history of architecture, profoundly important to the history of architecture, one of the great monuments of 20th century architecture, but it's also profoundly important to the city of Berlin, and has somehow taken the affection of the city. That's quite a difficult thing for a glass and steel building that doesn't work that well, has condensation from day one, and where it's quite difficult to put out.
Dirk, your role was to give insight into Mies' thoughts, actually, and your thoughts when you were leading the project in the 1960s. I'm wondering, since you inaugurated the building in 1968 until now, so much has been said and interpreted. How accurate were all these analyses? How much do you resonate with everything, and how much have you been able to pass on to David and his team in order to better understand Mies?
When you say how much do I resonate with everything that was written about it, not all of it. I'd like to tell you a little bit about some of the refinements, visual refinements, architectural refinements that played a major role as we studied the shape of the roof, the building. We built a model, 1/5 scale, meaning a fifth of the size of the elevation of the big hall. In our office, there was one wall that was about as long as this building is wide, something like that. And because Mies said, I think that if you build the steel roof totally flat, that it will look like the corners are drooping down, hanging down. Well, where did he get this idea from? I don't know, but it was Greek.
Greek temples.
Yeah, Greek temples. So we did that study model, and then we moved these sides up and down. And he would sit there with his wheelchair. In those days, he was already incapacitated, and look at it and look at it and think about it. And eventually, we decided, for visual reasons alone, not to speak of welding allowances and so on. There should be a 10-centimeter lift on the corners, and even a bigger one in the center of the roof. A very subtle, imperceptible curvature of it, so that when you're in it and underneath it, it wouldn't appear or give you the feeling that it's coming down on you. And then when the last time Mies came to Berlin was when the roof was being raised. it was assembled on the ground and welded together in one big plate, and then in the locations where the columns are, there were hydraulic jacks that lifted the roof up. And look, would you believe it? I say this only because it's a funny anecdote. That same day, the German Concrete Institute had its annual meeting in the Philharmonic Hall over here. When they came in to their meeting in the morning, they saw a big steel plate lying on the ground. And then it was raised up during the day, and when they were leaving at the end of the day, there was a steel building erected in one day. That was made the steel fabricators, the Krupp company, very proud. Anyway, Mies couldn't even wait for it to be all the way up. And he was very infirm on his legs, and he walked with crutches. And I drove him in the car we had rented onto the platform. There are pictures quite well known about this. And then we parked on the edge, and he said, I want to go under there. I want to see this. And he walked carefully under the roof as it was moving up very slowly. And I went with him. And of course, that wasn't allowed. That wasn't part of the security of the construction site. He didn't care where he stepped and under which part he was standing. I made sure I stood under the open cassettes in case it came down. But I know he then checked whether this little curvature had the right feel. And I remember that he thought afterwards, he said, I think we did this right. It looks good. And that was, sadly to say, the last time he really saw it. He never saw it finished. But this is the kind of care that he was used to. He studied everything to the nth degree. It was always amazing in his office. I never know how he made any money, because we spent more time than anybody I know. But that was his way of making sure he's doing the right thing.
Dirk, you're probably one of the few people on this planet who really can say what Mies was thinking when he was designing his last projects. How would you like his legacy to be perpetuated? How would you like Mies's message to be better expressed to the world, also referring to the way he has been interpreted?
Well, I think that the public in the world, wherever it is, whether it's in Chicago or in Berlin, has to deal with his buildings, and they are widely known and appreciated. Some of them need a renovation like this building did. There's no doubt about it. Others are in good shape and have already been renovated. I think future generations of architects will study his work like they do the 20th century architecture. And he will, in my opinion, remain to be seen as one of the great masters of this century. And his interpretation of emerging technology and new materials, such as glass and steel, play a major role. I mean, who else has pushed these materials to the nth degree as he did in this building? It's amazing. I have always, despite the fact that I worked for him and with him so long, I always felt very strongly I wanted to be my own architect and do my own work and not become a Mies historian. and to some degree I'm still fighting it today at this point in my life. But, there's no doubt he is a major player and will be remembered that way.
David, sticking to the Mies persona, how much affinity was required from your side with Mies in order to really understand all the facets of the project and start maybe almost thinking like he did and understanding his intentions?
Well, I think we wouldn't have embarked on the project if we didn't have a great empathy for the project and also huge respect for Mies himself, and that respect has not diminished through this process at all, even though, you know, there are lots of things in the construction of the project, and I can come back to that, you know, surprised us, but that was not Mies's intention. That was just circumstantial of the time. But I think, you know, I was trained in the sort of 80s, late 70s and 80s, and we were fed an appetite, a menu of, you know, Mies van der Rohe, Corbusier, and all the great modern architects. And I think in the intervening years, Mies, there's space between Mies and the others, in my opinion. I mean, I love the work of Corbusier, but there's something much more robust and timeless and relevant to Mies's work. And I think probably his history, his own personal history, is part of that.
Yes.
You know, in the sense that he straddled. You know, you mentioned Schinkel. Then we can go to Chicago. Then we can come back to Germany. And his architecture synthesizes the great optimism and vision and poetry of early modernism. On the one hand, you know, we got to remember he was head of the Bauhaus. You know, he profoundly believed in the alliance of design to industry and the machine age and all of that. But at the same time, he then became, you know, he became embedded in this other extraordinary moment of modern architecture, which was Chicago and corporate America in the 1960s, where this extraordinary alliance of, you know, coincidence of ambition and corporate power. It's very interesting. We can always find good architecture in cultural projects, but that was a moment when, if you think about Mies's work in America, you know, whether it's Lakeshore Drive or Hancock Building, Seagram in New York, you know, these are commercial projects. So Mies somehow gave face to not just cultural visions, but corporate vision. And then he brought it back here, you know, like a whole. So I think that's an extraordinary synthesis. If you think about from the Barcelona Pavilion to here, and everything that he took along the way. And I repeat, I think it's not easy to think about other architects, that modern movement, that really believed in how you build, and believed that profoundly affected the experiential work.
Yes, I would totally agree, and in fact, because he was not a studied academic architect. He had come out of the trade. In fact, when you really study and read about his beginnings, before he even came to Berlin, in his teens. He learned bricklaying, he learned stonemasonry, he learned plaster work. He used to crack up laughing when he was 80 years old and saying, I can still do with my left hand behind my back a Louis XIV ceiling decor, because that's what he learned in Aachen. You know, and he was proud but also true to, he was really a builder, you know, and it wasn't an academic intellectual pursuit alone. Interesting is, in my opinion, that here in Berlin, his first client, when he was 20 years old, was Alois Riehl, the Riehl House in Neubabelsberg, near Potsdam. Professor Riehl was a professor of philosophy, and he realized he has a talented young man there, but he didn't know anything about history or the great architecture, and he sent him at his expense to Italy, on a trip to Italy. And he went to Italy as a young 21-year-old, whatever, and looked at the great Florence and Rome and further south. And he also learned to appreciate and read philosophical books by himself. He was an autodidact. If you listen to him at a later age, particularly when he spoke English, he spoke very slowly, thoughtfully. He was known to be a taciturn architect, but part of it was that he didn't speak English very well, and he had to think how to phrase something.
But I think the other part is he believed the answer is in the work.
Yes.
The concept of narrative, which
Yeah.
you know we now become so familiar with as a way of explaining why we do things. Mies felt that the idea was in the work. It was not, and of course he had, he had big ideas about what the work should achieve in terms of space, but the ideas had to be communicated experientially through the work. Otherwise, they don't exist.
Yes.
Then it's no good. I mean, and there's a lot of architecture where you sort of have to read the script first, and then you say, "Oh, I see."
Yeah, it's true.
That's what it's about. Well, not with Mies. It's in it, and it is about it, and it's about how you build it, and therefore it remains experiential, because it's not, this little boat out there has been in stormy weather for 50 years. It's seen walls come down, it's seen things change, and yet it's a sort of defiant building against everything that happened.
I'd like to add something about the big hall, because that's the one that has been criticized from day one.
Yes.
Particularly by curators a lot. I mean, it's difficult to make an art exhibit there. But I can only add or tell you that Mies himself was aware of that, and that he thought of the space as a stage, Bühne, where you put mise en scène, where you put can't even say it in English. Put in scene, or what? Well,
Scenographic.
Yeah, where you have to install the exhibit, and that means there may be curtains involved, walls, and objects that make the stage design appropriate for what you're playing. And I think, even though it took a while for everybody to catch on, but when I look at the book that the Stiftung has published, not one of these, but an earlier one, over the last 50 years, all the exhibitions in that building. It's phenomenal. That proves to me that this did work. And your own exhibition of the wooden columns, that's fabulous, you know. It inspired people to be creative themselves and not just hang pictures on walls.
It's true, and it's been a critique point from the first moment, but then we've seen it evolve throughout the years. What was the significance of this architectural choice of this grand hall, this open space, indeterminate space, for museum architectural exhibition spaces throughout the world? Have they learned something? Have we learned something from it? Do you see a strong influence from this particular example here next to us, the Neue Nationalgalerie, that has had an influence on museum architecture throughout the world?
I think I have recently seen and read about some new efforts in redefining museum design. I think there's a trend also with look at what the artists are doing today, the digital art and all these technologically based ways of expressing yourself. That requires different museum space. And so I think there is a development going on that this building had something to do with it, but isn't the only instigator. There are many others and new ideas emerging. And I'm optimistic that the world will not stand still. There will be new ideas coming along.
David, you have amazing projects of museums, very well known. At this point, have you taken something from the Neue Nationalgalerie? Has it influenced you in any way, discovering the entrails of this building and getting to know every detail of it and understanding its genesis so well?
Well, let me expand the relationship between architecture and art. You know, and there was a very famous English art critic, David Sylvester, who wrote especially on Francis Bacon but another. And at some point in the late 60s, he said, "The artist has no greater enemy than the architect." And what he meant was that architects of that period were designing terrible museums. Not referring to Mies, but you have to think about museum design in that period was a real, architects were using it as an opportunity to experiment in architecture because there's a certain freedom in museum design. And I don't need to list them, but there were many buildings at that period which were not thinking enough about what makes a good museum. But once you say that, the question is, what does make a good museum? Because a number of people will say, you know, does the Mies building work? Isn't it functionally flawed? And weirdly, it does work for many of the reasons we said, because it's got these different components, the temple, the galleries below, and the garden. And together they work. Each one is flawed, let's say. You know, the temple has operational issues. The galleries downstairs are quite mundane and not particularly special. But this combination of things fulfills a number of things that a museum needs to do, because it doesn't need to do one thing. It has to show the collection. It has to present the collection in a good way. It has a whole series of internal responsibilities in terms of orientation and where you put yourself in relationship to the work. And the garden, for instance, downstairs, does a fantastic job at helping you orientate that. But at the same time, museum has an external series of issues, which is how does it relate to the city, and how does it become, as it were, part of the civic infrastructure. And the temple does that, in a very explicit way. As you say, it's a stage in a way. It became a civic stage. And I think that's why it found affection to people, because I think in this, imagine after ground zero in this city, we're talking about 20 years later, then this building comes as this incredible, optimistic, nearly utopian stage for people to meet in. And so, in that sense, when people say, well, it doesn't work that well, yes, it does, but it may have problems with light. And of course, we know now that thermally, we know that enclosing a building with glass is not the best energetic idea. So we've moved on from that. But I think when you say, have we learned anything from it? I think that we've learned a lot from it as confirming what we believe in terms of architecture, that architecture is substance and space and material, and it's about placing you in something, and that's what Mies always does. So I think it survived its functional challenges because he didn't over-obsess about functionality, because functionality changes. The truth is, it survives because it's a beautiful room. The truth is, it survives because it's a beautiful building, and you find ways of making it work. And what you were saying is, yeah, the first curators and that struggled with it. But if you believe that the building is good, you accept those challenges. And I think that's why this building is so powerful, is you can't say it doesn't have flaws. But on balance, fairly substantially, it's justified the incredibly intelligent and beautiful decisions that Mies van der Rohe made.
And I think this is what has elevated the building to the status of an icon, right? Because it really
because it's not a
surpasses.
silhouette. I mean, it's not because it's flashy or anything. And I think in the beginning, probably people, when you read some of the contemporary criticisms, they were a bit skeptical of this, roof, and it's not. So I think what's interesting is become an icon, not because it has this, fantastic silhouette or presence, but because of its integrity.
At the end, towards the end of his life, career, shall we say, he developed a keen interest in architectural spaces that wouldn't be completely defined and limited by their functionality. He was interested in space that is flexible enough to be readjusted by the function, by the owners, or by time, as time goes on. And I am sure in this building, in the coming years, there'll be fantastic exhibits, particularly if the artists or some talented people that have an aesthetic sense create these exhibits. So exhibit design is also a design, you see, and that is the link that should place the art properly, convincingly in the upper space. The lower space is more traditional, common, and not so, not so innovative. it was largely at the time influenced by what the Museum of Modern Art in New York was doing on their internal spaces. And we introduced, as far as I know, the wall washers in Berlin, because nobody knew really what that was and how that worked. And it worked fine, but the lights, the filaments of the bulbs were still glowing, which it gives you a red content. And today, of course, with the new lighting, we have a more daylight similar experience in that, inside. You know what I'm saying, yeah.
The building triggered indeed a lot of innovation, right? In the 60s, but I might wonder, at this point as well, have you found that decisions that you had to take drove innovation a bit further, that you pushed the edges of technology now as well in order to fulfill some of the requirements of the building?
Well, the strange thing about the building is that when we uncovered, we thought it was a restoration of surfaces. And as we took surfaces off, especially in the basement areas in the Sokol, we discovered that the structure itself was very poorly done. And then you discover, of course, it's fairly obvious that the resources in Berlin at that time were poor. You know? And I think we were all quite shocked at the construction quality. Walls with bits of wood in, and quite strangely primitive. And yet, if you went into that building a year before we started the renovation, people say, well, does it need renovation? I thought, I was there last year, it looked okay. It has this illusion, and from the beginning it had this, and I would be interested to know, because I haven't really asked you that, whether, it must have been very glamorous, especially within its context, that moment, this sort of rather American building, in a sense. And I was saying to someone this morning that I think one of the most, one of the sort of strange spaces that I really like is the powder room before you go into the bathrooms. A very big space with a lacquered shelf and a mirror. That's incredibly glamorous. And it's glamorous now because because normally most public buildings, there's no, you open a door and there's someone coming out the toilet and there's someone doing his zip up as he comes in there. And here, you go into this huge anti-space where there's nothing to do apart from put your attaché case down on your hat or something and straighten your hair. That's sexy now. It must have been incredibly chic to do that at that time.
Yes, I don't know if I should, but I'm going to tell you a little anecdote about this, which involves my experience. Because I drafted the washrooms. I detailed them. And I made sure that the seats are always aligned in the same distance to the next one, and that they line up with the tile joints on the walls. And I also knew already, from a little bit of experience I've had, that tile setters like to start in a corner of a building, and then they put the tiles in, and at the end there's maybe a gap, and then they put a half a tile there, or whatever it is. It's a very common problem. And sure enough, one day, the Bauleiter, das war ein Herr Neuendorf, I came off the plane and he took me directly in to see these walls with the pipes coming out of the wall. And all the workmen, the Fliesenleger, were standing around, and I looked at it. Now you have to imagine, I always had a little bit an issue with my age because I was damn young. Who am I to tell people what to do? Anyway, so I said, gentlemen, you didn't do this right. Look at the drawings. It says right here how to do this from here to here, and count the tiles and adjust a little bit by a fraction of a millimeter sometimes. Anyway, you have to do this again. This is not acceptable. So, next time I come to Berlin, Neuendorf takes me right in again, and they all stand around, and the walls had been redone, the tiles, and they were perfect. And I was expressing my pleasure and satisfaction that they did such a good piece of work. And I heard a voice in the background say, and I'm saying it in English now, but I should say it in German, den Lob kann sich sparen, ein Kasten Bier wäre mir lieber. The praise he can save himself, a case of beer would be better. So now, ever since I went into these rooms, and I'm always proud that it was done right. And I checked it out the other day, and it looks wonderful.
That's great praise. It's a wonderful conversation. Unfortunately, time is limited. So despite the fact that I still have a lot of questions, maybe let us just resume to one last question and then open a question round in the audience. So let's see what you can make out of my pathetic question. We've revisited the Neue Nationalgalerie now and looked at the past. Let's look at the future. How do you envision it in 50 years from now? The Kulturforum is getting crowded. Berlin has evolved enormously in these past decades. Would you dare to make a projection? Or let's say in about 50 years?
He's going to do the third restoration.
Oh my God. I would really go down into history that way. Okay. Well, I'm convinced the building will survive the next 50 years much better than it did the first 50 years, because it's in superb shape. Everything is technologically improved, and I cannot, for instance, this whole glass wall. You talked about the windows breaking and cracking and subdivided with little muntins put in. That shouldn't happen. By the way, the big windows, they're enormously large. Nobody makes them that big in the world except in China, some company. They're laminated together, 2 layers, which makes them stronger, but also reduces the heat transfer or cold transfer from one side to the other. Not that it's insulating glass really per se, but it is a better glass. And as I said, it's amazing how flat they are. They look so precise, so good, because one of the things I'm always looking at when we do buildings, how the facade gets warped or irregular because of the reflection that is warped from one glass to another. This is very good. So, I'm positive.
I think it'd be interesting to see where it goes in terms of it being a museum. To some degree, if you go downstairs, what's happened is that the architecture and the collection have melted together. These rooms work so perfectly for this collection. one of the discussions that happened a lot with Joachim and with others from the curatorial side, and Udo Kittelmann, was an anxiety about the carpet, amongst other things.
Yes.
And the reason they were anxious about the carpet was that if you were to put very contemporary work in there, that's not the architectural interior for contemporary work, somehow. And however, if you go there now, we insisted on the carpet, and I think the carpet's right, but also I think what happens is that the collection, the carpet, and the rooms, and everything goes together very well. To some degree, then, it becomes a slightly hermetic museum in the sense that it's sort of fixed.
The lower levels.
Yeah, the lower levels. Interesting thing is that the space that has been so highly criticized over the last 50 years will be the space that keeps it vital and contemporary in the next 50 years, because as you say, it's a sort of boon. It allows another dimension to happen, and I think that's what's so fascinating about the building, that, you know, he took so much critique for this useless space, but in the end, of course, that loose fitness that you refer to, that it's not super functional, has allowed people to respond to it. And in going forward, given that we don't know what happens to art, it is a space that one has great confidence will maintain a sort of contemporary role. To some degree, downstairs becomes a little bit fossilized in its historic moment. No? I suspect, unless they decide they're going to move all the collections around and do something else, but in some sense, I think it's sort of become, comfortable in the relationship between the room structure, the history of the museum, the history of the collection, blah, blah, blah. But it is interesting that the room upstairs remains very modern and very contemporary. So I think that will be the thing that stops it becoming a sort of monument of another time. I think it will always have that potential to be appropriate.
Thank you. With this positive thoughts, I would like to end my part in this conversation. Thank you.